Ukraine has been calling up its military reservists as the violence with Russian soldiers in the east is worsening. And while Joe Biden has already called Russia's actions an invasion, he's hoping inflicting financial pain on Putin might keep him from taking things even further.
I'm going to begin to impose sanctions in response far beyond the steps we and our allies and partners implemented in 2014. And if Russia goes further with this invasion, we stand prepared to go further as with sanctions.
Of course, this isn't the first time Biden has relied on sanctions to try to keep the peace abroad. After he pulled U.S. troops out of Afghanistan last year, he opted for economic consequences against the Taliban there too, cutting off foreign aid, which accounts for nearly a third of the nation's economy and the vast majority of its government spending. Biden also froze more than $7 billion of the Afghan government's foreign reserves and now plans to return only half to the country for humanitarian support, diverting the other half to families of 9/11 victims who sued the Taliban. And this has all dealt a powerful blow to Afghanistan's economy, which former UK Foreign Secretary David Miliband said at a U.S. Senate hearing earlier this month is rapidly deteriorating.
6 months ago, Afghanistan was a poor country. However, today, Afghanistan is a starving country.
Miliband urged Biden to make an urgent change in his policy, as have others. I'm joined now by Washington Post foreign affairs columnist David Ignatius. David, it's great for you to be here. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Jim.
Do you share Miliband's assessment of the situation in Afghanistan?
I do think from everything that I hear, including from David Miliband, that the situation is verging on humanitarian catastrophe. The Taliban is not making it easy for the world to help Afghanistan, but I think there have got to be ways to get aid to the country without the Taliban's hands on it, so that the level of starvation, suffering, just the human cost through this winter is reduced as much as possible.
Yeah, I've read most about starvation issues. What I haven't read as much about lately is the education of young girls. We've frequently had on the show a local woman who opened a school for girls several years ago. But it seems the problem is this, not just the Taliban's attitude about educating women, young girls, but also the ability to pay teachers. Has any of that been addressed or no?
It's being addressed, but inadequately. The Biden administration, State Department Special Coordinator for Afghanistan, Tom West, is trying to free up money that can be used to pay Afghan civil servants. The largest percentage of the civil service is teachers, and they're trying to condition this on reopening schools to allow girls and young women to be educated around the country. And they also want to find ways to monitor that. The Taliban has made not promises, but indications that it's prepared to open schools to girls, but there's got to be some way to verify that. So people see it as an important issue. They want to get the money to the teachers to be able to reopen the schools. There simply isn't yet an adequate channel to talk with the Taliban and get what we would think of as reliable, binding commitments to do these things.
Well, you know, I mentioned in the introduction to you the $7 billion of frozen assets. First half or a half going to the families of victims who are suing the Taliban, the other half theoretically the nation. Is the former defensible and is the latter doable? You seem to be suggesting there is no conduit for that.
There are conduits. There are ways that people have been crafting. There are financial institutions operating mainly in England that are providing money to be used by NGOs, by others who can pay aid workers. In some cases, who can get money to teachers. So there's a real effort to get money into the country, even though sanctions still are in place. I think we need to have a clearer picture. It's one problem with there being so many fewer journalists there. We need to have a clearer picture of what this suffering looks like, because that's what's going to motivate people to take action.
You know, speaking of suffering, one of the saddest parts of many sad moments about the evacuation was leaving so many people who had risked their lives, Afghans who had risked their lives to work with us towards a goal that was never achieved. Are we doing any better on that front, or are they essentially abandoned where they were?
They're largely abandoned. It's my understanding that the number of flights out, the flow out of people is very limited. Obviously, the Taliban doesn't want the educated people who can keep the country running to all flee, so they're making it difficult for people to get out. I think it's just a terrible situation. What I'd say, Jim, is having spent 20 years struggling to defeat the Taliban, but we thought create a free and modern Afghanistan. The idea of just abandoning it now to its fate, I think strikes a lot of people as wrong. It certainly strikes me as wrong. So I just hope people will be as creative as they can in finding ways to get money to people who are suffering and need it.
But to be creative, you have to pay attention. And one of the things I fear, and I wonder if you do, is that not just the American people, but our government has a hard time walking and chewing gum at the same time. And with all eyes on Ukraine, are there enough eyes on Afghanistan?
So all eyes at the top level, at the National Security Council, are on Ukraine, and you can't really fault that.
Of course.
The State Department's coordinator for Afghanistan, Tom West, is working as hard. I've talked with him. He is meeting with international relief officials, the head of the International Committee for the Red Cross. Peter Moore met with him recently, spoke to me after he left West's office, and said that he thought the U.S. was committed to trying to get things done, trying to make changes in our Treasury sanctions policy to make it easier for money to flow to humanitarian projects, despite the Taliban's refusal to make an inclusive government that would allow us to do this in a more straightforward way. So I think there's effort, attention at the mid-level, at the very top level. No, people are preoccupied.
You know, you wrote several months ago that Biden's greatest foreign policy accomplishment thus far had been restoring our global alliances, and you made a pointed exception, the lack of consultation with our allies around Afghanistan. I assume you believe that that experience informs the collaborative, very public position that Biden has taken in this whole Ukraine thing. Do you not?
I do. I just was in Munich last weekend for the Munich Security Conference, and it was a almost festival of NATO unity. I haven't seen the Europeans and Americans singing from the same songbook, if you will, in that same way for many years. And I think it's attributable in large part to the Biden administration's strenuous efforts to keep our European allies informed from the very first intelligence warnings that we had that something new was happening in Ukraine in October. But when that intelligence came through, the first thing that the Biden administration did was send CIA Director Bill Burns to Moscow to talk to the Russians to say, hey, we see what you're doing, knock it off. And that the second thing they did was to go brief the European allies. They sent the Director of National Intelligence, Ariel Haynes. She made this information available to an extent that we often don't. We often don't share that intelligence. And I think that's made a difference. And it's striking to me on the eve of who knows what the next hours and days will bring. Could be a nightmare. But I think that the U.S. and its European allies are united. The fact that the Germans, in a sense, have taken the toughest move yet, the Germans we often criticize for not being tough enough against Russia, they have stopped the Nord Stream pipeline. That's a big deal for Russia.
It's a huge deal. You know, speaking of things I worry about, the other thing I worry about is that the legacy of America First has become America only. And while Joe Biden has gone out of his way, at least in the last 24 hours, to be pretty transparent with the American people, not only about what he thinks Russia is doing, but about what the consequences of this will be for Americans. I don't know if you saw the Associated Press poll that came out, and we'll put it up for a second. How big of a role, it's not the most precise question, should the United States have in the situation between Russia and Ukraine? 2-1 minor role over major role. And by the way, it's not on the screen, but stunningly to me, the breakdown among parties was virtually the same, a little bit more among Republicans, but not much less about Democrats. That's bad news for a president trying to rally the folks back home, isn't it?
It is bad news. Those are scary numbers. If twice as many people think that we should play only a modest role in what will be the biggest international military crisis in Europe since 1945. Something's just out of whack in America. That's not good for our image, but more to the point, it's not good for our interests. The idea that we can just ignore a big shooting war in Europe and it doesn't affect us is, that just, I'm sorry, folks, but wait until you see your gasoline pump in a couple of weeks. So it does affect us. We do need to care. I think Biden just needs to communicate that more effectively to the country. I think it's been good recently that he's said to people, this affects you. You need to understand you have a stake in this. But people need to buy into that.
But it seems to me he's also, the difficulty he's having is not just with the American people. The difficulties he's having is with an outspoken former president who continues to cozy up to Putin. I'm sure you heard, here's a little bit of what Trump had to say yesterday on a radio show about what's going on.
I said, this is genius. Putin declares a big portion of the Ukraine. Putin declares it as independent. Oh, that's wonderful. So Putin is now saying it's independent, a large section of Ukraine. I said, how smart is that? And he's going to go in and be a peacekeeper. That's the strongest peace force. We could use that on our southern border. That's the strongest peace force I've ever seen. There were more army tanks than I've ever seen. They're going to keep peace all right.
Lapdog eternal, it seems to be. How does a current president overcome that when 70 million people seem to buy what he is selling?
The honest answer is you just have to ignore it. It's so completely, to me, off the wall. There's no, I don't know what could Trump possibly be talking about in this endorsement. I wish that this problem was as simple as Trump and Trump's influence. It isn't. Those poll numbers tell you something that's quite independent of Donald Trump, which is that the American people, after 20 years of frustrating, unsuccessful wars, are sick of the kinds of foreign involvement that our elites tell them are necessary. And so I get it. That's why communicating to the country and saying that this really does matter. Here's why it matters. Here's why your future is at stake in what's happening in Ukraine, a country real far away, but it does matter. And unless that communication is done, I think people are just going to stick with, as you put it earlier, America first. Why should I care about this? So that question has to be answered straight up.
David, last thing, ask you to play Nostradamus as best you can. I know it's really difficult in this situation. Is there an off-ramp for Putin here that allows him to save face, or are we just at the beginning of a long, deadly slog?
Jim, there was an off-ramp until yesterday when Putin blew it up. The off-ramp was the Minsk agreements, because there are two of them. And that was a way to resolve the crisis in the Donbass, these two breakaway enclaves in eastern Ukraine. Russia had agreed to it. The United States supports it. Our European allies have been negotiating with Ukraine. That was the exit ramp. And with Putin's declaration that these are now independent republics, the Minsk agreements essentially have been torn into shreds. That's the clearest sign to me that Putin's going to keep going. The way he would get out of this has now disappeared. He's now demanding acceptance of his maximal demands, a promise that Ukraine never enter NATO or some version of that. He's not going to get that. And so I think this one's going to go on for a long time, and I fear it's going to get really, really violent, especially for the Ukrainian people who will be fighting it alone.
David, I really appreciate your time, and please be clear, Cambridge misses you, David Ignatius. Thanks for your...
it's my birthplace, hometown. Love to be back there.
Hope to see you soon. David, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.